All right, everyone. Yeah, thanks for bearing with me here. Yeah, my name is Alan McConchie. I'm going to be presenting on behalf of my colleague, my boss, Eric Rodenbeck, who was supposed to be here today, couldn't make it. But this presentation is also kind of a collective presentation from a lot of my team members. I'm just going to be going through a lot of different maps that we have made at Stamen. With historical subject matter, we've been doing this a lot over the years, and we just want to take a moment to kind of look at what are the themes that are occurring in many of these projects. Got a link down there at the bottom, a short link, sta.mn/F7R for the slides. That'll be on all the other slides, so you can always refer to that. And those are our Mastodon links if you want them. It's also great to be here in Tacoma on the traditional land of the Puyallup tribe. Last NACIS, I was working on a presentation about getting native reservations on the map in OpenStreetMap, and so it was really interesting to learn about like the Puyallup reservation is particularly complex geography around here, around the city of Tacoma. So I'll talk a little bit about Stamen, then I'm going to go through these 4 projects that we've done in the past. One, the American panoramas, one from kind of way back, and then 3 that are a little bit more recent, or actually quite in the last few years. Mapping historical New York, some maps with Densho about Japanese internment here in the US, and some work with the Getty Museum about the project by artist Ed Ruscha's photography of Sunset Boulevard. So yeah, we're a design studio. Cartography and data visualization is our specialty. We've been around since 2001. We're a pretty small team, about a dozen of us, and we do all kinds of different things. We work for all kinds of clients like governments. We work for museums. We work for big tech companies. We work for local governments. Like whoever knocks on the door and says, hey, I need a custom map. I need a data visualization. We're like, sure, we can do that. I like to think of us as like expert amateurs or even professional amateurs. Like our job is to not really know anything about your subject matter, but to think about how a member of the public or whoever your imagined audience might be trying to work with your data, understand it. We know maps, we know data viz, but we're definitely not historians either. So it's really interesting to work with domain experts for all kinds of projects, learn from them, try to bring their ideas to a more general form of presentation, but also to help them really get into the really interesting details as well with the type of data visualization skills that they might not have or might not be familiar with. The American Panorama Project was something we started over 10 years ago with the Digital Scholarship Lab at the University of Richmond. And speaking of sessions that are going on at the same time, apparently the new director of the DSL is actually giving a presentation in one of the other sessions right now. They were looking to create basically a digital atlas of interactive maps of American history inspired by some print atlases that do a similar thing. They hired us to help them build the first 4 maps and to also develop the software to create more of these maps in the future. And so really, after these first 4 maps that we did for them, they've gone on and started just producing more and more really amazing interactive maps of different aspects of American history. So if you go to this page, you'll have to scroll down to see these first 4 that we made for them. They've just kept doing it, which is fantastic. It's great to see them being able to fulfill or reach towards that goal of making like 100 interactive data viz maps of US history. I'm only going to talk a little bit about 2 of these. So there's the 4 that we did. One was about the forced migration of enslaved people. That's the one on the upper left. There's one about the overland trails. There's one about foreign-born population of the U.S. And then about canals in the eastern U.S. It just happened to be that they were focused on the movement of people, of goods. That was the kind of the section that they were starting with. So a lot of these are about movements, but they're doing other things now. They're like doing a lot about, they've done maps of redlining and election information right now. So these 2 that I'm going to look at here, this first one, I'm just thinking about many of you have worked with historical data. You're familiar with getting into census data. And really, when we think about looking at the past, mapping the past, you're really grappling with the way data was collected. A lot of this is true about mapping the present as well, like who actually collected that data for what purpose. In the past, you run into a lot of missing data or incomplete data. Sometimes that tells you interesting stories, and we really wanted to use this as a tool to figure out and to explain where there are gaps in the data and why. This particular interface is every. I could spend probably a whole session talking about just this one, and I have in previous conferences. But what we have here, I've selected the county of San Francisco, California, because that has a lot of interesting spatial distribution of the immigration. And you can click through. There's a little timeline in the bottom that shows you the percentage of the population, according to the census, that was foreign-born in that county over time. We see a lot of interesting patterns here as you step through time. You see where there's like shifts towards heavy immigration from Europe versus Asia, versus in more recent years. You can see that it becomes much more global, and especially like more emphasis on Latin American countries. But we also, like, as we scroll through this, we especially at the beginning of this project, opening up the data, you would see things like, why is there a peak? I don't know if you can see it on this chart along the bottom in 1960. Like, how did suddenly the population of this place, and this occurs all over the U.S., why was it so much more foreign-born population in that year, and then it dropped again in 1970? Turns out that's telling us about the laws that had changed about how the data was collected. They changed the rules for how you were enumerated. You were, in 1960, even if you had some non-native descendants, however they were defining it at the time, it tells all these stories about how race was defined in different decades. But in the 1960 census, that number peaks, but it's not necessarily foreign-born. It's like foreign stock or whatever terminology they used at the time. And then it sort of goes back to the previous metric in 1970. We see things like, if we look, San Francisco, it is a particularly interesting example. If you go back to the beginning, we can kind of see a lot of foreign-born population from this thing categorized as China here. Then in later years, China disappears entirely because it was not showing up on the census, even though a lot of that population was still in San Francisco. Then in later years, it'll show up as a category of Asia, even though other countries in Europe might have been itemized individually. So lots of just really interesting things that we also tried to pull out at the bottom in a little text that explains what's going on in each decade, what you're seeing on the map, why it is actually interesting. These things that might be errors are actually telling you something about history and about how the data was collected. Next one I wanted to share was the overland trails map, because one of the things that we're thinking about a lot with these historical maps is the relationship between aggregated impersonal data, things like the census, although we'll see shortly that can be also quite personal as you look at data in the past. But a lot of the things that you can map from the past are things like individuals' travel logs or people's letters or things like that are actually quite personal, and you're getting a small glimpse of the past. For this project, the team at the University of Richmond had a bunch of undergraduates who were going through basically diaries of people who had traveled these overland trails, settling and colonizing the West, and basically writing down what they did each day, how far they traveled, what landmarks they saw, then geocoding that and being able to make sort of aggregated, quantified to some extent, maps of the rate of travel of the paths that were taken. We really combined a lot of these maps with data visualizations to try to bring out different aspects of the map, to try to not only, while you're giving someone a slider control along the bottom to step through time, but that would also step through a data representation of the bottom on the right, showing like the aggregate number of people that had been moving on each of these trails, but also these little lines on the bottom are inspired by these train travel charts that if you read like the Edward Tufte books, he's really obsessed with these diagrams of a train traveling through space and time, where one axis is like along the route of the line, the other axis is along time, and you can see an express train is a little steeper line, and a local train is shallower, and it makes more stops and it pauses. We were trying to use something like that to extract the aggregate information about how people were moving across space. So as you look down at the bottom, each section is a year, each line is an individual trip along these trails, and the vertical axis is actually longitude from some arbitrary eastern point at 86 degrees west and then to 123 degrees west. So you can kind of see, it's hard to actually like tell to what extent you can quantify it, but you can see that some of the lines look like they're getting a little bit shallower, or that people are traveling along the trail in the 1860s, maybe a month faster than it took them in 1840. But yeah, we're linked with the actual diary entries, so we're trying to tell these personal stories at the same time you're seeing them quantified on the map. So here's one that you click through, and you kind of see the dot move as you scroll through the story, describing the places that they went, things they saw. Other things to note about this map, and it's also a concept that we tried to use in that previous map too, is to really fundamentally question everything about the map, the base map that is underneath any of these historical representations. Like, this would not feel right if you put it on top of a modern day map. The foreign-born map, because we had that jumping of scale in terms of things were aggregated by continent, sometimes they were aggregated by country, sometimes that was missing. We had just these floating, sort of disconnected continental shapes. We didn't really use a real map for that either. This one, we only show cities and settlements that existed at that time. So if you scroll back to the beginning of the maps, you'll see some of these forts disappear because they didn't exist in 1840, but then they do in 1860. Look for the Sacramento appears in the middle, but by the time if you scrub back to the beginning, the city of Sacramento doesn't exist. So thinking about the map itself as a whole, it's not just the historical data we're showing, but like the map needs to be made historical for that time as well. A lot of those concepts come up for this more recent project that's been ongoing with Columbia University, mapping historical data for New York. Some of you, if you were here yesterday, you saw my colleague Kelsey Taylor and Eric Brailsford actually gave a whole presentation about this. So I won't go into it in too much detail. But similar approach of working with a completely different set of historians, different project, but what are these concepts that might be similar? What are the ways we may have dealt with historical data in the past that might be useful? So these are maps of individuals in the census in New York City that are actually going to the raw, the original like transcripts and interview documents from the census that are now made public after a certain number of years. So you can actually see what an individual person said their occupation and their race was, or what the census taker wrote down that they said it was, and where they lived. All these things that you can't really get with present-day census data, you can't get with the aggregated data, but you can get these actually quite personal data as you get further into the past. We did change the base map as well, because these are addresses in places in New York that many of these roads did not exist in the earlier days. Like, we can see the growth of the settlement of Brooklyn in 1850. There's not a whole lot of roads. The town is really just in the upper corner. And then by 1910, we made the base map such that you see the new roads. You actually like see things like parks that exist now or existed at that point. And even the coastline we traced. Well, and when I say we worked very closely with quite a big team at Columbia University. Yeah, zooming in, seeing the parks and the roads appear in the park. And so all of the things that would have been around as much as we can around these individual points. We had worked with a lot of these scanned historical maps, thinking at first maybe we would be able to use these as the background. most of them are still, there's a lot of historical scan maps that are accessible through this tool that we developed, but the maps themselves were just too colorful and too much detail and to actually put a good data viz on top of them. We can do some simplified points on top of these scan maps, but the really detailed ones, you want a cleaner base map. One thing that was interesting was even relying on these scanned maps that were coming from the New York Public Library. At some point during the course of this project, New York Public Library decided to stop hosting those scanned maps, so the Columbia University had to take over hosting this data because the source had changed and disappeared even in the course of this project. Similar to the Internet Archive going down, if that's where all your maps are right now. So realizing that even as you're trying to make maps, the data, the present day scanned versions of the data can change out from under you. And I'll just go into the really down into the city scale, because that's what's interesting about this map, down into beyond the city scale into the street level and the building level, the address level, the ways we experimented with dot density maps, trying to show the individuals scattered across the city block is how a lot of people have done them in the past, but we actually have addresses, so we wanted to group them by the actual building that people were living in. There's a lot more about the ways we experimented with these layouts of placing people as on a little pile, or we ended up with this ring motif. That was covered a lot more in detail in yesterday's talk. And a lot of these themes also occurred in this similar, well, not exactly similar, but a lot of the approaches to mapping individual data, mapping people's movements across space that we'd done on these other two projects also came up in work we did with an organization called Densho, which is about preserving the history of the forcibly interned Japanese Americans during World War II. We made two different maps for them over the last few years. One called Sites of Shame, which is mapping on the national level the location of these concentration camps. There's a light cross-hatching on the very left on the western states, which is the zones of exclusion where people were forcibly removed from. The dots of different colors are showing the different types of camps. And this map also shows individual stories, individuals' movements as people were taken from their home, put in one temporary camp, then moved to another camp, where they went to after they were released. Most people did not end up back where they were originally. And these are this kind of very, very sensitive individual stories, and these are people who, many of them are still alive, and no people who are alive. Our initial thought was okay, so we have to we have to anonymize this data somehow, but working with that client, they were well, no, the point of our organization is to tell these stories with the actual names. This is important. This is the project, is to have people who are present-day descendants of the interned Americans, be able to say, this is the story of my grandmother, this is what had happened to her, and just how their orientation around privacy of data was really interesting for us to work with. And this one example is one for one of the largest camps called Manzanar here in California. And the colors of these lines are showing where the people who were interned there, most of them came from the Los Angeles area, are the green lines. And well, they're kind of greenish brown. They look kind of green on my screen. The blue ones are where they went after the camp, so you can kind of see that most people who are left Manzanar ended up further east. So the second project we've done with them was diving into this individual camp. So from the national scale, we're going into a very micro scale, and this is where there's a lot of parallels with the work with Columbia and New York, is within the camp, we know where each person was living at what time during their internment at that camp, what building they were in. This is a historical site now. Most of the buildings are gone. Some of the evidence of those roads that were there are still there, but you can visit the site today. One thing that's also interesting about this one is, unlike with some of this data is sure from the government sources of people who were perpetrating the internment, but also the people in the camp had their own newspaper. They were creating a lot of this documentation as well. So it's interesting to use this combination of sources of what the camp looked like, what the individual building functions were. A lot of that was like from those newspapers that were published by people in the camp. And so we have things like, right now this is colored by gender, and we know each individual and who their family members were in this data. So even mapping like where, how you can highlight any one individual. So like this is like zooming in on some of these like barracks in this camp. You can click on one person and you can it'll highlight everyone else in their family, and you can kind of see were they bunked in the same building with their family, or were they split up even across the camp. So all these parallels with how do we map those things without like a bunch of dots overlapping each other. We don't really know. We know somewhat about even the interior layout of the buildings, but you can kind of see like these patterns of like the circles, the little triangle shapes. Working on how to like lay out this individual point data, something that we'd never really had a need to do before. And so like the ways we solved it for the Manzanar project and the ways we solved it for Columbia are a little bit of dialogue. Both of these were like ongoing projects where we kind of continued to do work with them. So I've lost a little bit of track of like what things we did first and what things we did second. And then finally, I just want to talk about one that's a little bit different flavor from these others, but it's also an ongoing project that is making us think about other ways that we deal with historical analogs of present-day data, the tools we use to extract meaning from them. We've been working with the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, and they have the archives of the artist Ed Ruscha, and one of his most notable projects, well, he's done a whole lot of different things, but one of the things that they wanted us to work with him about was his project called Every Building on the Sunset Strip, where in 1966 he basically drove up and down Sunset Strip in LA with a camera mounted on a tripod in the back of a pickup truck and just like took pictures of like everything. So this was like early street view, effectively. Like he was just doing this as an art project. What it feels like to like index an entire street, this cross section through a city. So he made a book of it, which was like the original form, but all of his photo archives are part of the Getty's collection. He's still alive, and he's actually still doing this. He's done multiple shoots. So we created this project that called 12 Sunsets, because they have scanned in and geo-referenced 12 of his panoramic shoots, and there's actually more that they're still continuing to georeference. But we created a tool that lets you browse through those on a map, and your cursor is a little pickup truck. And you can drive along, and it'll like slide past and show you the photos. So you can add years, and they're never perfectly aligned, but they're pretty close. So now we have at the top the 1985 panorama and the 1990 one below it. And you can kind of see things like, well, was that Tower Records still there? What were the things that were being advertised in the windows? What are the billboards looking like? There's a lot of just totally interesting things that you can see from this archive. And figuring out how to present it, how to let people explore this, but also what other kind of scholarship can you do with an archive like this as you scan in all of these interesting photos? So that one's with 85, 90, 95. Some years he used color film, some years it was black and white. Even just figuring out things like how would we show the reflection of, because he was shooting both sides of the street, how do we show the other side of the street? Is it upright but inverted down below, or right now we have it so it's upside down, but you click a flip button and then it'll flip the view. Those were like things that we've never really had to think about, and extracting meaning from this is the next thing we really were trying to do. So you can, in this tool, look for tags that have been detected from optical character recognition. So they ran that on all these images, and it extracts Well, actually, not only extracting things like any text that it sees, but also extracting just machine learning, like it can detect whether there's a tree in the photo, things like that. So even if there's no tree in a billboard, we can get tags like a photo, the machine thinks that this is a landscape picture, which kind of is, or it thinks that this is an airplane, but there's not an airplane in here. So even just understanding, like revealing the limitations or the interesting things that occur by running an algorithm and learning how the algorithm thinks is also an interesting thing that now, as a lot of historians are having to work with, like how do we use forms of AI, forms of machine learning in our scholarship. We have a lot of this work ongoing now. There's going to be more of this that's going to be current research into like how we're using these tags is going to be published in coming months. So there's just some rough shots that are sort of interesting of things that we're discovering, things we're seeing. Looking at the tags, like, okay, well, if you look for the tag car is going to show up a lot of places because there's cars everywhere on the street. Seeing if we can detect, where are things that are more residential area or not. Like, what are the signals that would let us see, because Sunset Strip, basically Sunset Boulevard goes through some pretty dense urban areas through Hollywood. Then it also goes up into the hills, like very residential areas as well. So you see, like, some of the photos are like full of trees, and some of them are just full of buildings. And so what are the patterns you could detect, and can you start to see any of those changes over time? We're interested in, like, can you see the Blockbuster videos appear for a certain decade, and then all the Blockbuster videos are gone, or telephone booths that are starting to be removed from the landscape? So what are the things that you might be able to learn about how cities change that you simply don't have this type of photographic archive for most other places over this many years. But yeah, some of these, like the tags are interesting and bizarre, and so clicking through any one of these spots on the map, you can get into the individual image and see what that particular frame looked like, where it was located, what are the visual tags are one set of words, and then the text that's recognized is the second set along the bottom. Weird things showed up, like we saw that the word don't is picked up a lot. We noticed that pretty much you see only don't walk signs, you never see walk signs, and then once you stop and think about it, you realize, well, that makes sense, because if you're shooting the camera out the side of your truck and you see a walk sign, then that means you must be going through a red light. So like you're only ever picking up don't walk signs because that's the only time you're driving through and seeing the side of a crosswalk. I don't know what you would do with that as a researcher, but it's interesting. Turns out a lot of the airplane detections are at the end of Edrichet's rolls. He would, or just ones where he would mark out with an X, like he thought that was too blurry. We're not going to put that. He's not going to put that into his book. The Getty Museum scanned all those and geotagged them. So you have all of these photos that have a big X that he probably wrote on the negative, and the machine learning thinks that looks like an airplane or something like that. Yeah, so that is just, we really are, continuing to work on historical data. We're hoping to get more of this. We'd love to continue to think about ways that we can apply any of this learning to other projects that might be similar, or projects that will like test any of these assumptions. But yeah, some of these are very different approaches to historical data. We would love to think about any other ways that you all have been using visualization and maps in your historical research as well. So yeah, get in touch with us and let me know what you think about this, and thank you all.
Thank you very much, Alan.
Thank you.
Are there any questions? Yes.
Yeah.
Kind of hinted on automation a little bit. How long did some of these, like the first few projects, how long did those take you to pull all the data together?
Well, yeah, the question is how long did it take to get the data together? And a long time, but we luckily didn't have to do most of that. Yeah, the benefit of working with academic researchers is that they often have teams of undergrads and grad students to do things. But there's often a lot of weight. So like with the New York project, those are all, they still only show Manhattan and Brooklyn. They're working on collecting the data for the rest of the boroughs of Manhattan, so they can do Queens and Bronx and Staten Island, but I think the timeline on that is like kind of years waiting for that data to be available. And I know a lot of, there's collaboration between different academic groups. Like I think a lot of the really cleaned up data from those census note taking were done by like University of Minnesota or something, and that Columbia is working with them. So there's a lot of the labor of collecting this data is like, it's hidden to me at least. Yeah. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on mobile first design for some of these applications? Do you have any? Because these are complex to design,
Mm-hmm.
but you can see that they are mostly accessible through laptop or like a particular speed.
Yeah. Yeah. Question about mobile first design for any of these. I would say that's rarely a consideration for most of these. And which is unfortunate. Like we do try to think about ways that you can't get most of the experience, but if you could get some of it and make some of it shareable or enough that it's compelling that you don't completely bounce off when you try to open it in mobile. But yeah, the scale of, especially things like those, the American Panorama projects, a lot of that was like almost 10 years ago that we were doing some of that work. So I think people's expectations for being mobile first was a little bit lower back then, but still, like the amount of views that we want to be able to have on the data to create this kind of like holistic, like you've got multiple charts showing all the different things, how it all fits together. Trying to design that to even remotely work on mobile is something we barely scratched the surface of thinking about. Yeah. It really depends, though. I'm trying to think of other cases because I think a lot of the historians we're working with, like what their goal is, they're assuming that people who are going to be engaging with this are going to be taking their time, or might be doing it in a classroom setting, or they're going to be doing it somewhere where they can kind of assume most people will be on larger screens. Like a lot of those panorama projects are like made to be part of a classroom setting. But yeah, I think if there are, and I'm just thinking the analog or the parallel with a lot of the projects we do maybe for environmental like groups where they're trying to get someone to take an action, and we might create like a very elaborate data visualization for like the Audubon Society or something, but they really need a shareable version as well. We just are not having a lot of our historical research clients asking for that as a top priority.